So
what else? What do you want to know?
when were you
let's just
born?
start at the beginning. When were you born?
When was I born? I was born in 1930 on a hot July day.
Where?
It was sticky for you that day?
It was a hot July. It was July 10th, 1930. I wanted to go to school because all my friends went to school when I was 4 years old. And I cried to my father. Everybody was in school but me. So he took me to the kindergarten, lied about my age, and I got in at 4 years old. Consequently, I graduated, and since my birthday is in July, I graduated high school when I was 16. All my friends at college were the year ahead of me. So when I learned they were graduating early and I would be left by myself, I took extra courses and graduated college when I was 19. When I went to Harvard and got a master's in a field that mystified my parents.
What field was that?
Romance philology, which still interests me a great deal, but is of utterly no economic value. But I don't regret a minute of it. I got out of Harvard with a master's and I was, what was I, 20? I think I was 20. Then I went to the University of Chicago and studied educational administration because I was going to save the world via the schools. But I got stuck at the thesis level. I did all the coursework, I think, by the time I was 22 or something, but I couldn't write the thesis. So I decided to teach temporarily until I became in. So I taught at some local high schools, one of which I'm still connected to. I established what are called Fern Awards for junior students. I did it for junior students because seniors know everything, but juniors don't know everything yet. So if a junior gets an award, he spends another whole year at school having been an award winner.
Huh.
So there are Fern Awards that are offered every spring at Leiden Community High School. Actually, there are two high schools there now. At those both high schools, they're a big event, and I go out and speak every time, or usually, and I meet with the kids and try to impact their lives in the 1 hour I have with them privately. I meet with two groups, one from each high school, and anyway, so I'm still connected with that school, and I made good friends on the faculty there. Anyway, I taught there, and then I went to Italy to study. I got a fellowship at the University of Padua, which is not far from Venice, where I spent a year. Had I had a way of making a living, I would have stayed, lived there.
You liked it?
Yeah, I loved it. Italy's a marvelous country. I love the language, I like the people, the food, the history, the archaeological sites, the architecture, the whole thing. It's a wonderful country. Mm-hmm. And I made friends at the university, of course. Never spoke English the whole year. And was on the verge of deciding to just stay there when my mother decided she'd better bring me home. So she came over and we traveled around along with a cousin, Charles Kalish. Mm-hmm. And then I came back and I heard from the university that if I didn't finish, I'd lose all my credits. So I had to finish my thesis. I buckled down and I wrote it on, the title was Problem Solving and Decision Making in Educational Administration, which was the subject of mirth among my friends because I could never make up my mind. This time, the subject was making up your mind. Anyway, I studied how other people make up their minds in educational administration. Mm-hmm. I worked with a workshop that was being held at the time with the school administrators. And then within a week or so, I kept my promise to my father, flew east and started working in the supermarket business. He was in the supermarket business. He was a founder of ShopRite stores, which started in New Jersey and are still going. Anyway, I agreed. I became personnel director of a small ShopRite chain that grew, and of which my father was a founder. My father started out with a very small store on Milburn Avenue, tiny place, about as big as this room.
Well, he began as a butcher in Elizabeth, working for his sister, right?
Well, that was when he first came to this country.
Mm-hmm.
He came to this country when he was 14. He wanted to go to America. His mother said, "What would you do in America? You're only, just a kid." He insisted, so finally they wrote to your great-grandfather, Uncle Max, whom everybody wrote to have a ticket to come to America.
Because he was already here.
Yeah, he came early. So Uncle Max sent a ticket to my father so that he could come to America, emigrate to America. He came all by himself, speaking only Yiddish. They tied the train ticket to the button on his coat so that the conductors at each station would look at the ticket and put him on the correct train. He got as far as Rotterdam, had to wait for a boat that had a cheap enough class in it so the ticket would be valid. It was the third class ticket. Uncle Max didn't send first and second class ticket. He came over, worked for his brother-in-law, lived with his sister, worked for his brother-in-law on First Street in Elizabeth. And then when he got married, my mother said she would marry him only if he had his own business. So he opened up a store in Milburn, New Jersey, tiny, small grocery butcher shop.
Why there?
Well, there was a small store there that was available for sale. So he bought it, and he made it a success. And then after some while, he decided to move to a larger place around the corner, which he did. And about that time, there were a group of men, it was immediately after the Second World War, a group of supermarket business, or grocery and supermarket businessmen, Jews, decided that they needed to compete with A&P, which was the giant retail food supplier. And the only way they could do that was to combine their buying power into one group. So they decided to form a cooperative. They made that decision in our living room in Milburn. There were 5 of them. And it was in that living room that Sunday morning that Wakefern was created. It was created by Weiss, Ehrlichman, Kesselman, Eisenberg, and Fern. Those 5 guys. They then determined to have a warehouse in Newark, which they rented a small place. Somebody donated a belt, a conveyor belt, so they could bring stuff up to the 2nd floor. And within a year or so after they started, they decided to advertise themselves as ShopRite, so that they all became ShopRite store owners. In order to have greater buying power, they needed to attract more stores. So it was easy at that point for store owners to come and say, "Would you let me in? Could I become a ShopRite store?" After a while, when New Jersey became fairly full of ShopRites, it was hard to get in. Then it was difficult to gain membership into that cooperative. After a while, some of the successful members combined their efforts. So they took their ShopRite stores, put them together, and created corporations. I was getting my doctorate at the time. One group invited my father, and he asked me if I wanted to join. I really didn't. So he didn't. Then a second group got together. And I said, well, let me think about that some more. And he said, there's not going to be another chance. You could do this one or that's it. So I agreed to join in as soon as I finished my doctoral thesis and got my degree, which I did. And I worked there for 6 or 7 years, I think.
Why personnel?
They needed a personnel director, and that was my background, and I hated anything. I had to train in a grocery department, a dairy department, a produce department, the cashier department. And I worked there as a kid, and I just hated the whole, but personnel was more interesting. And I had a background in school administration. So consequently, I became personnel and training director, and I ran the department like a school, as I would. And I decided I'd had enough supermarkets when they said they were withdrawing from ShopRite and becoming Pathmark. When I get ready to start hiring for a warehouse with, 1,500 employees, and the thought of interviewing and and dealing with another bunch of people at that level was just something I couldn't bear. So I left, and soon after started working at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I directed a master's program in teacher education. And then when my father died, I couldn't afford to work there anymore. They weren't paying very much money. So I had to take over the business and slowly sold the interests, kept the real estate. And although I didn't realize it at the time, I essentially retired. Started working on my projects. Still had to deal with investing my money, but stayed busy. I had about a 2-month vacation and then I got busy. I became involved with a bunch of friends and and after a couple of years, with a very good friend of mine, Irving Cooperberg, who since died, was one of the founding members of the gay synagogue in New York. It began as a small group with no pretensions at all, and for a long time we didn't need a rabbi. There were people who were members of that group, several of whom had graduated from a rabbinical school. So we led our own services and had our own community and so forth. And then when AIDS came along, we really needed help in dealing with community problems. It was just too much for volunteers to do. So we decided to hire a rabbi. We had a president who was very far-seeing at the time, and he appointed one member of every social group or every circle within that synagogue to be on a search committee. And I was the representative of the old timers. Every group had somebody who joined this committee, and there were 8 of us. And we started searching for a rabbi. We decided that it could be a man or a woman, a person who was either straight or gay, but it had to be somebody really good who would be able to run our community well. Mm-hmm. To choose her, we not only investigated her background very carefully, and I made some phone calls to previous places where she had worked, but there was a group of us that went to hear her preach. She was giving a sermon up in Hartford. At the time, she was working for the Reform movement. So we went to hear her give a sermon, see how does she perform at the pulpit. And she spoke on the parsha that deals with Hagar and Ishmael, as well as Sarah and Isaac. Most rabbis who speak, or every rabbi until then that I ever heard who spoke on that parsha, talks about Sarah, they talk about Isaac, they talk about so. Not her. She spoke about Hagar and Ishmael, quite contrary to anything I'd ever heard before. And she spoke brilliantly. That was when we knew we picked the right person.
Mm-hmm.
So my aunt tells me that you were interested in the family tree since you were a kid.
Yeah, I was.
What started that?
My father was very interested in family, and I think the thing that really started it was going to a wedding and being told that my sister and I were going to sit with our cousins at the same table. That meant teenagers. And I sat down with a bunch of teenagers whom I didn't know. They were my cousins, but I didn't know who they were. And I came back after that thing and I said to my father, I gotta straighten all this out. I don't know who everybody is. So I took a piece of paper and we started, and I just simply started doing a family tree, a descendant, what we call in genealogy, descendancy. Where did we start, and whose children were whose, and who married, and so forth.
How far back were you able to go then?
My father could go back only to his grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't know much about that either.
Mm-hmm.
And my particular family tree was particularly complicated because my parents are cousins. And I tried to put both families on the same piece of paper. So I ended up with a piece of paper. I glued the sheets together, and they stretched from here all the way to there. Later, when I started working on this in earnest, that youthful effort, which I did with the help of my father and my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, turned out to be priceless.
That was the early
You still have it?
Still have it. There is a small, not quite a synagogue, it's like a Jewish center, a small Jewish center now that exists in Rehovich. And I went there to visit. It's kind of a combination, prayer center, study center, social center. And I went there because I wanted to hear the Yiddish accent that I was familiar with when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, I heard the family speaking with this very strong local accent. You don't hear that because it's not the standard accent. It's a regional accent that is considered not the best Yiddish. The best Yiddish, the standard Yiddish is Litvak Yiddish that comes from further north. But I wanted to hear that Yiddish. So I was traveling there with my friend Yaakov, who speaks Yiddish. Northern Yiddish, not Galiciana Yiddish. And we met a man that we were introduced to who came from there originally. And when he spoke Yiddish, I understood him perfectly. But Yaakov had a terrible time, even though he's fluent, because the accent was so difficult. Anyway, I said to Yaakov, listen, I want to hear somebody who came from the Rehovich who speaks Yiddish the way I remember my family speaking it 50, 60 years ago. So we go to the center, the Yiddish center, the Jewish center, but everybody there came from somewhere else. The local people were either killed or they emigrated. Very few left. We met a woman there, a young woman, and we asked her, do you know anybody? She said, my mother doesn't come from Rehovich, she comes from Sambor. Sambor is a town about an hour from the Rehovich by car, maybe an hour and a half from the Rehovich by car, where Fern family number 2 comes from Sambor. And the accent is pretty much the same. She said, my mother used to speak Yiddish. If you come tomorrow at 2 o'clock or some hour in the afternoon, I will tell my mother you're coming. You can talk to her. So we did. We came back the following day at 2 o'clock. We brought the guide with us to speak to them in Polish or Ukrainian. And we met with her and her mother. Well, the mother had survived in Sambor during the war because a Ukrainian had fallen in love with her, a Gentile. And he supplied her with food. He sneaked food from the outside through the ghetto wall and so forth. And she survived. After the war, she married the guy. He was really crazy about her. And she had this daughter and a son. The son had emigrated to Israel on the strength that his mother was Jewish, so they took him. But the daughter stayed there and the mother stayed there. But the mother had not spoken Yiddish since the war. I mean, since the 1940s. And it was hard for her to get back into that language again. So Yaakov began to speak to her in Yiddish, although his accent was different. And then he started to sing a song that everybody knows. Kids know it. And she began to sing with him. And by the time they got through verse 3 or 4, she had regained her facility. He ran out of verses, but she remembered one that he didn't know, and he sang another one. We spoke Yiddish to her. I also went to find out where my grandmother, my father's mother, sold goods at the market. She made a living by buying produce from the peasants who came into the market 2 or 3 times a week to sell their produce, their farm produce, at the market there. What she would do was she would go to her sister, her older sister, Mendelssohn, Mottel Mendelssohn, who lived in the house from Borislav, where her husband's family found oil and they became wealthy. So she would go to this sister, this older sister, and borrow 2 crowns, 2 kroner, 2 crowns, with the understanding that by the end of the day she would give back the 2 crowns. She could use the 2 crowns for the day. My own theory is that sister was jealous and said, okay, you can use 2 crowns, she could have given her sister 2 crowns and forgotten the deal. But every week she had to go there and borrow 2 crowns and give it back by nightfall. She borrowed the 2 crowns, and then she went to the highway where the peasants were coming in from the countryside with their wagons of stuff. It didn't matter what they had. She would run alongside the wagons and see, she could tell by looking what they were selling. Were they selling peas or mushrooms or potatoes or whatever? And she would say, I'll buy this from you. You don't have to go to the market. I'll give you 2 crowns, you give me this. And finally, one of these peasants would say, oh, it's a lot easier to sell it for 2 crowns than going to the market ourselves. She would take a huge basket of whatever she got, mushrooms for example, first take it home, take from the top whatever she needed to feed the family for the day, and the rest she would take to the market to sell to recoup the 2 crowns and maybe get a little more so she could buy something else. I wanted to see where that market was. So I went, I asked and went and found it. That market still exists. Wow. And you could tell it existed at the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th centuries, because of the poles and the structure and the structure on the top that were still in place, that had been used for canopies. They would put the canopies on those poles. They were still there. And I knew walking there, I said, my grandmother came to this spot and this is where she sold those vegetables. So that's still there. And there are a number of large buildings that are still there that are 19th century and some older. there was a trip that she took with Max, with her father Max, to Drohobych. By that time, Max was fairly successful in business. Anna was a young lady who was feeling rather successful herself socially. At any rate, and very self-assured. She was always a very self-assured woman. Young, later, she just had a sense of knowing what she was doing and moving ahead on that premise. At any rate, she appeared in Drohobych, and from somewhere Max had rented a car, and she was driving the car, and she went down the main street of Drohobych dressed very well, including a small hat with a pheasant feather that must have gone into the air at least a half a meter up into the air. She drove straight down the main street, looking neither left nor right, while the crowds gathered on the edges of the road and stared in amazement. And all the Jews looked at her and they said, "Kik, look, a dama tochta wagen, a woman, a lady is driving a car." My father was among that crowd. He was still he was somewhat younger than she was, had not yet emigrated to the United States. So he was still there, and he remembered her as the cousin from America who came and drove this car down the main street of Drohobych. Years later, when they became friends, he reminded her of that, and he talked about this feather. "Oh," she said, "I remember that hat." She said, "That was a pheasant feather, and it went straight up." She described the hat. She remembered the outfit perfectly. That was sort of typical of Anna.